Lesson 5. Consciousness of Man. This lesson is on consciousness, the essential attribute of man. Consciousness is one of man's essential attributes, along with independence and creativity. Leader Kim Jong-il said, "Consciousness is an attribute of social man which determines all his endeavors to understand and reshape the world and himself." Consciousness is an attribute of social man which determines all his endeavors to understand and reshape the world and himself. Man's activity to cognize the world and himself is cognitive activity, and his activity to transform the world and himself is practical one. Consciousness is an attribute that determines cognitive and practical activity. Consciousness is an attribute of man to plan so that all his activities to cognize and transform the world can be made rational. Because he has consciousness, he plans what to cognize, transform, and obtain on the basis of calculation of vital need and real conditions. Consciousness is also an attribute of man to coordinate and control actively so that all activities can be made correct in line with several new conditions and circumstances in the cognition and transformation process. Because he has consciousness, he controls his behavior in conformity with several problems and situations arising newly in the cognition and transformation process. Consciousness is high-class function of brain, the most developed physical organ of man. Consciousness, the function of brain, commands and controls all activities of man. Man's brain has physiological and conscious functions. Man's brain helps all tissues and organs of man's physique to combine each other and act in an integrated manner, and man's physique to make proper relations with outer environment. Thus, it helps man's activities to make regular and exist as a living organism. Man's brain administers his physical life activity. This is biological function of man. Man's brain has high-class function of consciousness that controls social activity peculiar to him. It is a high-class function of brain that controls man's activities to cognize and transform the world and himself. It is essence of consciousness, the function of brain. All social activities of man, that is, purposeful and conscious cognitive and practical activities, are ensured by consciousness, the function of brain. Man's consciousness, the function of brain, can be largely divided into ideological consciousness and knowledge. Ideological consciousness is the consciousness that reflects the demand and interests of man, the basis of stand and attitude to things and phenomena. Ideological consciousness is the main in consciousness, the function of brain. All the people's psychological conditions are based on and determined by ideological consciousness. Ideological consciousness is divided into ideological consciousness of popular masses and ideological consciousness of exploited class according to class character. Knowledge is consciousness that reflects essence of things and phenomena and laws of their change and development. Man has consciousness, the function of brain, that reflects not only his demand and interest, but essence of the objective and law of its motion and method to apply it. Knowledge is divided into scientific knowledge and experience, according to profoundness of its content and level of its generalization and systematization, into social scientific knowledge and natural scientific knowledge, according to which object it reflects, and into basic scientific knowledge and applied scientific knowledge, according to its function. Knowledge plays an important role in cognitive and practical activities of man. The more profound knowledge on nature and society man acquires, the more actively he makes cognitive and practical activities in line with profitability by rationally utilizing his strengths and objective conditions. Ideological consciousness and knowledge, the important forms of consciousness, which is function of brain, are closely related with each other. Ideological consciousness defines direction of learning and using of knowledge. Ideological consciousness defines what kind of knowledge and how high level of knowledge people acquire and where and how they use. Scientific knowledge is prerequisite and basis that enables the people to acquire ideological consciousness. Only with scientific knowledge, man can be correctly aware of his demand and interests. Ideological consciousness and knowledge are the important contents of consciousness, the function of brain. Here, ideological consciousness is the main. Of course, knowledge plays an important role in man's activities, but the decisive factor determining man's activities is not knowledge, but ideological consciousness. Ideological consciousness is the decisive factor that determines value, character, and all activities of man. Among man's consciousness, the function of brain, strength of ideological consciousness that determines all activities, is called mental strength. It is because among ideological consciousness and knowledge, which form spirit, the consciousness of man, the former is the main, and spirit, the consciousness, is represented and decided by the former. Mental strength is in essence ideological and spiritual strength. In other words, it is spirit of independence, the strength of faith and will to shape one's destiny with it in his hand. Man's mental strength is consciousness that ideological consciousness of independence is turned into firm faith, that is the strength displayed by firm faith that one is master of his destiny. Man's mental strength is also consciousness that ideological consciousness of independence is turned into strong will, that is the strength displayed by will to shape one's destiny by himself with it in his hand. By the action of consciousness, whose contents are ideological consciousness and knowledge, all activities of man are made, and consciousness becomes his intrinsic nature. Consciousness is an attribute of social man. As he is a social being, man has consciousness as an essential attribute. Consciousness is an attribute of social man, and therefore man's activities aspire after the building and developing of the society in which consciousness is displayed to the full. Thank you for this lesson. Next lesson, we will discuss about essence of the world.